What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to Strength Coach Rants. Today we're going to be talking about full versus partial range of motion training, its benefits, downfalls, all that kind of stuff, and this guy right here. If you're listening and not watching, the guy I said we're going to talk about is Dr. Joel Seedman. Now, Dr. Joel Seedman is a fitness charlatan and a grifter online to make money. I fully believe that. I think the guy doesn't believe even the own shit that comes out of his mouth. But we're going to go over, and the reason we talk about him is because he is a big proponent of partial range of motion training without really a whole lot to back what he says. So I'm going to pull up something that he posted this morning because this one I think is really important because it highlights a lot of things that he is wrong about. But he posts, let me just pull it up. All right, so caption is why 90 degrees, and he goes on to list 10 different things, 10 reasons why 90 degrees is superior to, full range of motion when training. And I'm going to list them off here, but he's, if you're listening and not watching, he is holding two bumpers long ways in his hand. So he's gripping around the edges of the bumper and pressing up overhead, coming down into about a 90-degree position at both the elbow and the shoulder, and then pushing up overhead. So the 10 things that he lists are joint health, hypertrophy, stability, strength, alignment, posture, symmetry, power, athletics, and recovery. And then later on, he says there's a bonus one, and that bonus one is mobility. Mobility is the bonus. So I'm gonna break down why he's wrong about most of this stuff and why I believe he doesn't even believe the nonsense that comes out of his mouth, and he's doing it merely for eyes on social media to grift and make money. But joint health, 90 degrees. So we know that's a lie. There are, in weight-bearing position and not weight-bearing positions, there are places within the range of motion that are healthier for the joint. Now, for a squat, right, the bottom range of motion, at least for the knee, it is substantially healthier. There's less shear. There is more patella and femoral coverage of each other, so those forces get displaced. If we're talking about joint health, he's not right there, right? I know, God, watching athletes do partials in the bench, it doesn't look healthy. To overcome that inertia at 90 degrees with a heavy load on the bench puts you in a position that's relatively dangerous for the average individual. Now, if we're talking about athletes that have very high levels of a higher training age, then maybe. But overall, it's pretty mixed bag here. Joint health isn't necessarily increased when we train at 90 degrees. Hypertrophy, we're going to go over some studies today, some meta-analyses of various studies that show that he is wrong here. Stability, again, I'll go back to what I said about joint health. To be stable at 90 degrees, right, and overcome. So if we're talking about isometric holds at 90 degrees, okay, maybe. But if we're talking about overcoming any level of inertia, I'll use the bench as an example. The odds of you being stable in that position on that transition from down to pause to up, most people aren't going to be very good at that. So I would say by and large, stability, he's wrong. Strength, now this is where I will give him a little bit of credit here in the sense that partials can be beneficial to strength depending on what that strength is for, right? So if we're playing sports and we need to get stronger and increase rate of force development at specific joint angles that aren't full range of motion, I completely agree with that. I do that with my athletes here. We do some partials. We'll do some box squats that are relatively high or considered high to increase that rate of force development at that specific space and time. And so I do think that there is some benefits to it. Also, by going through partials, the loads tend to be a little bit heavier because our leverages are better. So yes, you more than likely will be quote unquote stronger through that range of motion. But overall, I think he's wrong. Alignment, posture, and symmetry. This is 3 different ways of saying the exact same thing. Your alignment, your posture, and your symmetry, they all go hand in hand. They're all essentially the same thing. And I will say again, look at his posture in this video here, right? I wish this was a side angle, because if you look at him, you can see how overextended he is in his lumbar spine. Now, maybe that's because the load is way too heavy, and the load is probably way too heavy because he's doing a ridiculous exercise for one, but two, like, he's only going through a partial range of motion where his leverages are better, so he's handling more load than he should, which is causing his posture to suck. You can see his rib cage popping out through the front of his shirt. He is well overextended, so his posture sucks here. Athletics, again, I will go back to the partials. Power is next. Yeah, power is next. I'll go, same thing, that and athletics. I'll go back to the partials where specific joint angles, increasing power and rate of force development from those spaces. I think there's absolute value and merit to that. The data shows it. So I will give those two to him. And recovery, which is nonsense. And we'll go over that later on. But the added bonus that he had in the comments, which was mobility, is insanity. The way that we become more mobile is to become strong at end ranges. If you don't touch those end ranges, you're not going to be more mobile. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to like squat ass to grass, and that has to be how we get those in range strength gains. It can be isometric holds, body weight isometric holds. I do those all the time with my athletes, and I think there's absolute value to them. But to say an overloaded partial 90-degree joint angle is going to be beneficial to mobility is insanity, and it goes against everything that we know like within this field right now. So this was the one he posted today. I wanted to spend a little bit more time with that one because I thought it was ridiculous. But we're going to go to some of his own personal training, like personally, like meeting himself on Instagram here. And this first one here we go. All right, so he is, for those of you listening and not watching, he's doing a deficit deadlift here, all right, with a straight bar and what looks to be about 275 pounds. And he's standing on top of more than likely either a 10 or a 25 and a 45-pound bumper, unless they're kilos. It could be like a 10-pound kilo and a 20-pound kilo, 10-kilo bumper and a 20-kilo bumper. But if you watch this, right, so for the guy who preaches partials all the time, right, putting himself in a position where he's at a deficit, I commend him for it. But the problem is he lifts this like it's a partial. If you're not watching, his ass shoots up right away, legs are straight, and then he finishes through with his hips. Like he's not... This is not good. Some people kind of got after him in the comments. I think that one I read, dude preaches 90-degree joint angles all the time and then does a deficit deadlift that places him at maximal hip flexion and well over 90 degrees of flexion, right? So, yes, again, constantly preaching 90, constantly showing 90, and then doing something like this, although butchering it, I think is a little bit hypocritical, but it is what it is. And this just goes to show that his 90 degrees, right, doesn't actually increase mobility because he really struggles to maintain that position coming out of the bottom there. One other one I wanted to look at was a squat that he posted, and here we are. All right, so my heaviest squat ever. Dude set up with like what looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 2, 3, 4, 7 45s on either side, facing out of the rack, coming down into slightly more than a quarter squat, and then racking it. So a couple things wrong here. One, like the only reason the bands are here is to get you more interested. Like they're doing next to nothing here. I can't imagine that band tension is all that high because his range of motion is so poor. The bands really aren't doing all that much here. They don't look to be super heavy bands or wrapped around. They look like maybe they're double wrapped. I can't tell. But the bands aren't doing much other than getting you to see that there are bands there. And then maybe ask questions, get in the comments, get his video out there more. And that's essentially what he's doing here. The thing that really bothers me about this is when he does these squats, whether they're with himself or his clients, he consistently has them facing out of the rack because it looks better on video. In reality, like this is super stupid. If I'm doing a 1-rep max and I'm walking forward with it, that's going to be infinitely more dangerous than coming backwards with it. When you're fresh, walking backwards is a lot easier than after expending every ounce of energy you have, then having to walk backwards and figure out where the hooks are in the rack behind you. So this is this really gets under my skin because kids are going to watch this and they're going to do this same shit. And then some of them are going to end up getting hurt, right? And is that his fault? No, but you got to understand kids are going to do what they see. They're going to mimic what they see on social media. And this guy has a big following, so they're going to think he's right. All right, so that's my thoughts on Joel Seedman. I think he is a grifter. I think he's full of it. And I think the fact that he preaches partials, I think maybe that should give us pause and we should look into it a little bit further. And that's what we're going to do today. So this whole video isn't about Joel Seedman, but it is about the things that he preaches and how there's a lot of data to suggest that he is absolutely wrong. So I think he's a total grifter, and we're going to get into all of the science behind the partials now. Back to partials. Now, there's been tons of studies. I say tons. Really, in all honesty, there haven't been that many studies done on partial range of motion versus full range of motion training. There tends to be a lot of issues with these studies. Sometimes it's the sample size. Sometimes it's the study, like the actual sample population, where it's very common in sports performance, exercise physiology, strength and conditioning, and these studies to deal not with like well-trained, high training age athletes or bodybuilders, where what we end up with are 18 to 25-year-old untrained males tend to be like 90% of the population within these studies. And what we know about them is that in the beginning, anything will work. So it's really hard to take that population and say whatever they did in this study works, because anything would have worked. I'm going to pull up, there's two meta-analyses that they've come out in the past 3 years. One just within the past couple months. And it went over the various studies. So what a meta-analysis is, if you don't know, is a study of a bunch of studies. So what they do is they take all the literature that's there. They have a way of breaking down like what should be included versus what should not be included. And then they take the information from those studies, combine them all together to come up with an answer to whatever question they were going to ask. So this first one, again, is a little bit newer, I believe. Let me pick that up. Ooh. Nope, this one's actually the slightly older one. This is from 2020. All right, and this is the effects of range of motion on muscle development during resistance training interventions, a systematic review. So again, this came out in 2020. That was 3 years ago. I'm going to pull up one from a little bit more recent right after this. But what they found was the studies generally show that training with a full range of motion produces similar or greater increases in muscle size than training with a partial range of motion, right? And the second study... All right, this came from the International Journal of Strength and Conditioning. The previous one had come from the Journal of Strength and Conditioning. This one was slightly more recent. I believe it actually came out this year. It was in a journal within this last quarter. And what they found was full range of motion outperformed partial... where did that go? Full range of motion outperformed partial range of motion for all outcome times, but the effect sizes range from trivial to small, right? What does that mean? So what they found was that partial range of motion training, when it came to hypertrophy, when it came to strength, when it came to all those things that Seedman says are like way more beneficial if you train through partial range of motion, it found that not only did partial range of motion like was it, not better, that like in every single instance, the full range of motion had better outcomes. Now, these outcomes these increases, better outcomes, I guess we could say, were trivial or small, meaning that, you're better off. So you could do either, right? They're not that far off from each other, but a full range of motion is going to be slightly more beneficial. Now, what I will go back and say is when I was talking at the very beginning of this episode, there are specific joint angles that are more beneficial to sport. We know our athletes, there's maybe 1-2 sports where your athlete is going to need strength at the very end ranges of motion of a squat, and that's going to be wrestling and mixed martial arts or jiu-jitsu. Anything where you're rolling around on the mat and you're getting put into like very disadvantageous positions, having strength at that range is going to be beneficial to you. But outside of that, there's not really a sport on the planet where you tend to spend a lot of time below 90 degrees. So I understand what Seedman is saying from that perspective. We need rate of force development, we need power, we need strength, all within a specific range of motion for sport. And that typically is right around 90 degrees, maybe a little bit more, probably a little bit less. I remember years ago, people were giving LeBron James a whole bunch of crap because he posted this video, I think on Instagram, because it was before TikTok was popular, where he was grinding, right? He had just signed another deal and he was grinding in the gym and showing everybody how much he was doing. Everybody gave him crap because he was doing these like partial squats that were slightly below like a quarter squat. But like, he's got a good strength coach. That's a very beneficial angle for him. He's going to be able to overload that movement at the top. And as long as he stays in a good position, right, that is going to carry over to the field of play. That transfer of transfer of training happens at those angles, and that's a good thing for him. Now, when he's jumping, he's probably jumping from that position. When he goes to stop, he's probably slowing down and decelerating around that joint angle, right? So those are very beneficial. But outside of that, if we're talking about like the health of the hips, the health of the knee, the health of the shoulders, hitting in ranges is invaluable. Doesn't have to be super heavy. So this is something that we do here at the gym. The vast majority of my athletes, when we box squat, it is slightly above what you would consider parallel or quote unquote depth in a squat. The reason for that is because those joint angles are more beneficial to them than squatting below depth, right? So squatting slightly high is going to have, in my opinion, a better carryover to the field of play. It also allows them to handle slightly heavier loads, right? Which is going to have an impact on both strength, or on all three: strength, power, and speed. And if they can maintain a good position, right, that movement pattern is going to transition to the field of play, which is a great thing, right? So, but we make up for those things, right, by doing deficit training or training through a full range of motion, doing some single limb work. We do deficit lateral lunges. We do deficit reverse lunges, right? So we do our movements where we hit more than full range of motion. We also spend a lot of time doing in range of motion isometric training, especially for the hips. You know, some of my overhead guys will do them for the shoulders. But you can get away with doing those partials if you're also placing in these other pieces to make up for like the range that you're not hitting. You have to spend time below parallel if you want to have healthy hips. That's why I said like mobility is increased by training at 90 degrees is absolute insanity. I heard him say in I forget when it was. This was like 2 years ago. He had a debate on Mark Bell's strength. What is it called? Strength Pod or Power, whatever the hell it's called. It's Mark Bell's podcast. And he had a debate where he was talking about how it is detrimental to go through more than full range of motion. And while I'll agree with him, like in some instances, overall, that's like not very beneficial. Let me actually, I think we'll do that in a different scene. So just as far as strength goes, as far as hypertrophy goes, as far as mobility goes, as far as recovery goes, none of those things that he says, like training partials, none of that is supported by any of the data. So like, if you're trying to have healthy overall hips and you're trying to be the best athlete possible, yes, there are places where partials like are good and they are helpful, but it should not make up even maybe more than like 10% of your overall training. The vast majority of your training needs to be through a full range of motion. And before I kind of end this, I'll give you one more example. If we're talking about like throwers, right? So that could be javelin, that could be anything overhead where we're kind of in this position throwing like a baseball. So it could be baseball. It could be softball because they're still overhead even though they don't pitch from that position. Training through 90 degrees is absolutely detrimental to their overall shoulder health. A pitcher or a baseball player has to develop power from that very end range of external rotation, and you just can't get there by going to 90 degrees. It's impossible. They need to develop strength in those bottom ranges. That's going to be what carries over to the field of play for them. So if you're going through just partials with your overhead throwers, I think you're really missing the boat here, and you're going to end up putting them in not only a position to like not play to their full potential, right? But putting them in a position to be hurt. So there are times when partials are beneficial, right? But there are also the vast majority of your training needs to not be partial range of motion training, because we have to think about the overall health of the joint, and that's only going to be achieved by going through full ranges of motion. All right, so back to Seedman. I'm going to let you kind of hear in his own words. This was an interview he did with Israel back in 2021, so it might have been exactly 2 years ago, about his thought process when it comes to partial training. It's a great interview. It came from Mark Bell's podcast, the one I was talking about earlier. I think it's Mark Bell's Powercast. If you're interested, you'd have to scroll through it to find it, because it was 2 years ago. But this is going to be him talking about why he thinks full range of motion training isn't quite as necessary. And after he goes over this, we're going to kind of break down everything that he said, and I'm going to give you my opinions on it. But here we go.
Talking about knees over toes, guys, I was saying that he and I actually agree on a lot more than what we disagree on. So I think the one area that you just called it out is the range of motion component that we probably have differing views on. A few things there. I would say that one of the keys to making sure that an individual who maybe goes through more extreme range of motion, like a martial arts sport or jiu-jitsu, or maybe even dancers or rock climbers, it's another one, wrestlers. One of the keys that I always say is, hey, you just got to practice your sport. Okay, that's one of the best ways to keep that sport specificity, that range of motion for that sport.
So I actually don't disagree with him here. A lot of times we try to make everything in the gym, and we're coming at it from different angles here. So I agree with him, but I don't agree with him. A lot of times in the gym, the thought process is we need to mimic your sport, right? We need to do X, Y, or Z, when in my reality, right? So the way that I program, a lot of times what we do in here becomes the anti-sport. So it's the things that they're not getting on the field of play. That's how we round out an athlete. So I don't disagree with him here about how your sport should take care of a lot of the things. And in my opinion, conditioning more than anything else, your sport is the perfect modality for conditioning, because it's the same movement patterns, it's the same effort levels, it's the same sports skill, it's literally the same everything. So I think the sport should take care of a lot of these things. And I'm going to let him finish here, but then I'm really going to break down why he's wrong.
Saying, hey, don't even practice your sport like that. But in my opinion, one of the best ways to prepare the body for that sport is actually practicing that sport. And if it requires larger range of motion, then when they're practicing that sport, I think they obviously need to get into it. They need to be prepared for it. One of the things I would also say is that people have been getting into extreme range of motion in their respective sports for decades, centuries actually, or millennia. And it was well before the dawn of the fitness industry ever came about. So it's not like we needed deep end range strength training or deep end range fitness training to get people to be able to perform deeper positions in their sports. People have been.
So he's right here. However, this is the first time in history where we see the sitting epidemic and the phone epidemic, right? So our entire posture outcomes have completely shifted from where they were even 30 years ago because of the lifestyles that we live. So yes, we're not spending as much time below parallel. We're sitting a lot. I mean, you think about it, your average day, you wake up, let's say you're fortunate enough to have time to eat breakfast in the morning. You sit down, you eat your breakfast, you get up, you go, you sit in the car, you commute for a half hour to an hour to work. What do you do when you get to work? Chances are you're sitting at a desk. So you're doing that for 8 hours. Then work's over. What do? Maybe you go to the gym, but how do you get to the gym? You sit. Then how do you get home from the gym? You sit. Then what do you do when you get home? You either sit at the dinner table or you sit on the couch. So we have an epidemic of postural nastiness. So while he's right, he's wrong in the sense that it's not the same world. It's not the same place that it was back in ancient Greece. It's not the same place it was even in circa 1995 America. The smartphone has really changed a lot of things, and the lifestyles we live now are vastly different from the lifestyles that we lived even 15, 20 years ago. So he's right, but he's wrong.
To get into those positions for years, and I would actually argue that the ability of individuals to get into these extreme positions now is worse than it's ever been, even though we've been emphasizing this so much. So I would say that one of the best ways to make sure individuals are ready.
So it goes back to what he was saying. Like, we spend more time on it now, and everything's worse than it ever has been. That's drawing correlations that don't drawing conclusions from correlations. Just because this happened and this happened doesn't mean that they're caused from each other. I think our efforts to combat like the issues that we have in society, sitting all day long, being on our phones. And, even when you sleep, or if you're a slide sleeper, you're sleeping in a fetal position. So everything's incredibly short. It's not that we have poor outcomes because we're spending so much time on this. It's that we have poor outcomes because we're probably not spending enough time on it. Throughout our day, we don't make the changes that we need. Like 30 minutes to a half hour day isn't going to undo the damage that we do over the course of the next 16. So he's wrong here. And I just wanted to point that out.
Extreme positions is make sure the muscles and the tissues are healthy in general. They're not inflamed. The muscles are able to absorb force, so that if they are caught off guard and have to get into a more extreme position, their muscles are healthy, their tissues are healthy, they're not inflamed, their body's not sending inhibitory signals because there's so much pain and discomfort. It's like if somebody gets put in like an arm position where, again, I'm not.
So he's making the argument here that training through full ranges of motion is actually increasing poor positioning when it comes to these things, which I think is absolute nonsense. I think the fact that we're not spending time like in positions that are beneficial to mobility, that's causing those issues. I think 90-degree training is gonna like compound whatever issues you think you may have. Now, that doesn't mean that we need, for somebody who has a shoulder issue, right, that we need to bench press 90% plus of our 1 rep max through a full range of motion to try to fix that. It means that we need to spend time down there. It doesn't have to be super heavy, but it needs to be like some kind of load that's going to force us to adapt and increase tissue resiliency in those spaces. So again, I think he's totally wrong here.
Martial arts expert. But if they get put into a certain position and that shoulder has been, inflamed and tight from just doing excessive range of motion, maybe like on bench press for some reason. Okay.
So the shoulder's tight from doing excessive range of motion, which would be full range of motion. This guy's a moron.
If they get put in that position, their body's probably going to shut it down even more. They're going to have no strength there. Whereas if the tissues are healthy and they get put in that position, they'll probably have better ability to absorb force. But I also understand what you're saying. It's like, hey, we're not talking about doing so much training in that position where it produces inflammation. So, but again, I would argue that humans have been able to do these extreme positions well before the fitness era or end range training ever came about.
So humans have been able to do those things, yes, because like our everyday lives, like us being in those positions, right? So everything's changed now. We live between like being in a seated position and we're sitting all the time. If we're sitting, we got our head forward. We have absolutely horrible posture as a society by and large. So it's not the same as it was back in ancient Greece. It's not the same as it was, like I said earlier, as it was in 2005. Like, everything's changed so much. So he's arguing from a premise that I think is completely false. And I'll let him finish. He's got about 20 seconds left here.
Training that I do does not take that ability, that innate inherent ability, away from them. We're just adding to that by giving them a therapeutic stimulus to make sure their muscles are stronger and more resilient.
Do you consider your training therapeutic and not ergogenic then?
All right. So there you have, in his own words, the reason why 90 degrees, right, is better for most people. He's under the impression that we're inflamed from training through a full range of motion. He's under the impression that because for all of eternity, we've been able to, get by without having these, what he calls extreme range of motion training in the fitness industry. And I think it's just he's cherry picking data and drawing like conclusions from correlations that like, it's not looking at the whole picture. So if your rationale for training partials has anything to do with the things that Joel Seedman is is kind of pushing here, I would take a hard look in the mirror and try to figure out, like, take a look at the data, look at people who train through full ranges of motion versus people who don't. Think how you feel when you're training through partials versus when you add in, those deficit lunges, those higher step ups and step downs, in range of motion strength training for like the hip adductors, abductors, extenders, all that kind of stuff. Because like you're gonna feel substantially better if you do have strength at those end ranges. And I think Joel Seedman is doing the fitness industry a huge disservice when he talks about these things. And I know this was quite a ways back, but he doesn't seem to have changed his opinion whatsoever when it comes to these partials. And I think it takes a very, very specific population to draw the conclusions from training that he does with, casting such a wide net over everybody, saying that partials are better for everything. All right, well, there you have it. That's my take on partials versus full range of motion. Some of the data does suggest that it can be beneficial. Like I said, I utilize them here in the gym when the overall goal is athleticism. You could also make the argument that maybe from a hypertrophy standpoint, if you're handling a heavier load, that's going to create more damage, which will, in essence, like help us to grow more. So maybe, you could make that argument, even though most of the data suggests, or almost all of the data suggests that training through a full range of motion is going to actually increase the hypertrophy gains, if you will. I think Joel Seedman is an absolute grifter. I'm not positive that he believes a lot of the things that come out of his mouth. I think he has found a niche online and that it has become relatively lucrative for him. And that's why he's doing what he's doing. So, I mean, I get it. I respect the hustle, but I think it's really damaging to the fitness industry as a whole. Mostly, though, the sports performance industry, to have people like him that are constantly posting these ridiculous, partial range of motion lifts. You should go peruse his Instagram. It's really interesting, some of the things that he has on there. And in interviews he will say like, this is only like 20% of what we do. 80% of what we do is the regular lifting, like squat, bench, deadlift, hinge, pull, push, all those things. He says that's 80% of what they do, but it never ever makes an appearance on his social media. So what that does for most people who aren't going to seek this guy out is it makes them think that this training is what's beneficial and is what's going to make them better at their sport or healthier or feel better, when in reality that's just absolutely not the case. All right, well, this was the third episode we dropped this week. I don't know that I'll be able to keep that up, but we had a pretty light week with a lot of athletes out of town, so I thought I would take advantage of it and, post a whole bunch of episodes. So if you're one of like the 50 to 100 people that watch or listen, thank you, and I hope you enjoy it. If you have any questions, always feel free to reach out. I'll put my email in the description of the video, along with some other articles that we've written that may be pertinent to what we talked about today. But thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.